Hi, I'm Ken Davis, and welcome to another Don't Know Much About Minute. Actually, we're going to do something a little bit different today. I have a new book coming out called A Nation Rising, and I want to talk a little bit about that book and what led me to it. So, in typical Don't Know Much About style, we're going to ask a few questions, and I'll give the answers.
You're not a trained historian or academic. How did you come to write history books?
The answer is very simple. My very smart wife once said to me, "You love American history, why don't you just write about it?" It was around the time that people were talking about how dumb we are about history, and the answer was very simple. Why are we so dumb at history? Because it was boring. I simply wanted to write good stories about real people and real places. I got that love of history from taking camping trips when I was a kid to places like Gettysburg and Fort Ticonderoga, and I learned that history doesn't just happen in books. It happens to real people in real places, and some of those people are villains, so-called villains, like Benedict Arnold or Aaron Burr, and sometimes the villains are the most interesting characters.
What is A Nation Rising all about?
A Nation Rising tells the story of what happened between 1776 and the Civil War, those famous 77 years ago that Abraham Lincoln once talked about. More precisely, it goes from 1800 to 1850, when America went from a few states on the Atlantic seaboard to an empire that spanned the continent from sea to shining sea. There are 6 stories that the textbooks usually leave out. They're stories of courage, conspiracy, conquest, but most of all, they're stories about real people, and they're that hidden history that unfortunately doesn't get told in our history books and sometimes in the museums that you find in these places.
Of all the things that happened between 1800 and 1850, how did you choose the 6 stories in this book?
These stories kind of found me, and that's often the way these books come about. I set out doing research on one subject, and I find myself going down a rabbit hole in a completely different direction. For instance, I went down to learn about the Battle of New Orleans and Andrew Jackson, and I found out about a completely different battle, the Battle of Horseshoe Creek, and a massacre at a place called Fort Mims. 2 places that were completely left out of my school books growing up. But this is where Andrew Jackson really began his war against the Native Americans, the war that was brutal, very unjust in some ways, and gave him his nickname, Sharp Knife.
So many people say they hate history. Why is it so important anyway?
History is important because it really matters about who we are as a people. It matters because we keep making the same mistakes over and over again, it seems. And we can not only learn from our mistakes, but certainly from our successes. And this book talks about some of those mistakes and successes. We can certainly learn about the character of the American people. We are fighting about immigration and religion in this country. There's nothing new about that as I talk about some of the fights over immigration and religion in the 19th century in A Nation Rising. But most of all, I think it's important because it's about who we are as a people, and that's what I really want to tell.
You've sold more than 4 million books. Why isn't your name mentioned alongside notable historians like David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin?
I guess I'm the Rodney Dangerfield of American history. I don't get no respect. But seriously, when I hear the names Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough, those are 2 of my favorite historians, certainly people I would consider my literary mentors, and I would be very thrilled to be included alongside those people. But I get much more satisfaction from hearing a teacher who says, "My books helped turn their kids onto history," or a parent who says, "Oh, your books really made my children love history for the first time." I've also heard from teachers who say, "Your books made me want to teach history," and that's the greatest accomplishment of all. It's really more important to me, I suppose, to get people connected to history, get them excited about it, to share my own love and enthusiasm about it, and I'll let the critical accolades and the comparisons to other historians, I'll leave that to other people to decide.
What do you say to critics who say you are tearing down our history and heroes with your negative approach?
I have no problem with so-called negative stories as long as they're accurate. For years, we've told a history that's more like a bedtime story than real history. That's one of the reasons people are so bored with it. You can't talk about American history and heroes like Andrew Jackson in his new book, who was capable of reprehensible things without telling what he did. After the Battle of Horseshoe Creek, he had his men cut off the noses of the Indians to count the casualties. Of course, you can put that in the context of the times, but you can't cover it up and you can't gloss over it. I tell these stories not just because they're sensational or lurid or certainly not negative, but because they're the truth. And they are part of our hidden history, and that's what makes it all the more fascinating.